Ever get that feeling where you're just starting to wrap your head around something really complicated, and then bam, everything changes?
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of how it feels watching the news out of Gaza lately, right?
Hmm.
It seems like every time we think we're getting a handle on things, there's a new twist or turn.
Definitely.
So today we're going to dive deep into the latest escalation in Gaza.
Okay.
Yeah, try to unpack what's been happening since that truce ended back in late January.
Sounds good.
And just to be clear to our listeners, we're drawing from a whole range of sources for this deep dive.
Right.
News reports, firsthand accounts, and even some of the more in-depth analysis that's out there.
Yep.
Our goal today is to really cut through all the noise and get to the heart of the matter.
Okay.
So you know, what are the key events?
Right.
What are the numbers telling us?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the broader political context that's shaping this whole situation?
Yeah.
We want to make sense of this really complex situation for you.
Gotcha.
All right, so let's rewind back to the end of that temporary truce at the end of January.
Right.
It wasn't a slow burn back into conflict, was it?
No, not at all.
It was pretty sudden and intense.
Yeah, it was like as soon as that truce was over, Israel launched these massive airstrikes all across Gaza.
Wow.
And it just escalated incredibly quickly.
Like, how quickly are we talking?
By Thursday morning, local health officials were already reporting at least 85 Palestinians killed.
Just a couple of days.
Exactly.
And that's just in the initial stages?
Yeah, it was a major shift from the relative calm of the ceasefire.
No, it wasn't like Hamas just sat back and did nothing.
No, they didn't.
They did fire 3 rockets toward Israel.
Right.
Though luckily no casualties were reported on the Israeli side.
Fortunately not.
But I guess it does show that both sides were ready to jump back into the conflict.
Yeah, it definitely highlights that the underlying issues haven't gone away.
Right. Even though there was this huge difference in the scale of the response,
Yeah.
it shows that the conflict is very much alive.
And it also suggests that this time around things could be a lot more serious.
You know, one of the things that really struck me was how quickly the casualties mounted on the Palestinian side.
Yeah.
In just those first 3 days after the truce was over, reports were saying at least 592 Palestinians had been killed.
According to the Gaza Health Ministry.
That's a mind-blowing number in such a short time.
It is.
What does that tell us about what's happening?
Well, it points to an intensity of the bombardments that we haven't really seen before. It's not just a continuation of the previous fighting, it's something else.
Different now.
Well, the speed and the volume of the casualties suggest that something's changed.
Like maybe their tactics.
Possibly.
Or what they're choosing to target.
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely different.
And we have to remember these aren't just numbers we're talking about.
Right.
Each one of those is a human life.
A person with a family, a story.
And, you know, it's just so hard to grasp the scale of the loss.
Yeah.
When you hear descriptions like an entire pound wiped off the map, even if it's not literally true, it just gives you a sense of the devastation.
Absolutely.
It makes it feel real in a way that numbers sometimes don't.
Yeah, those kinds of phrases, while maybe not always perfectly accurate, do convey the scale of the destruction.
And the feeling of loss.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these intense airstrikes happening, and then on top of that, Israel goes and reimposes the blockade on Gaza.
Right.
Especially in the north.
Uh-huh.
What's the impact of that?
Well, it's basically trapping people in their own homes.
Really?
Yeah, if they left during the ceasefire to try to find safety, they can't get back in.
And those who stayed behind?
They're pretty much stuck, too.
So they're cut off from the outside world?
More or less.
I mean, I know they're not being told to evacuate or anything.
Right.
Which would obviously cause a huge international outcry.
Exactly.
But the reality is they're essentially confined.
Yeah, they're really limited in terms of where they can go.
And the only way out that I've heard about is on foot through the coastal road, which sounds incredibly dangerous.
Especially for families with children or elderly relatives.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine trying to navigate that in the middle of a conflict.
It's a really desperate situation.
And I guess a lot of people went back to check on their homes during the truce.
Yeah, thinking it was safe to start rebuilding their lives.
And now they're trapped again.
It's a terrible situation.
Okay, so we've got the airstrikes, we've got the blockade, and then we're also seeing reports of Israeli ground forces moving both in the north and the south near Rafah.
Right.
Plus, they've taken back part of the Netzrim corridor, which basically cuts Gaza in two.
Yeah, that's a significant move.
What do you make of that?
Well, the ground troop movement suggests that this might not be limited to just airstrikes.
You think there could be a ground invasion?
It's a possibility that we can't rule out.
And what about the Netzrim corridor?
Well, historically, that's been a key dividing line in Gaza.
So by retaking it...
Israel's essentially splitting the territory in two.
And what does that mean practically?
Well, it could make it much harder for people to move around.
and for aid to get through.
Exactly.
And it also has implications for any kind of unified governance in the future.
Right. It's a move with a lot of potential long-term consequences.
And then you've got all this political stuff happening inside Israel, too, right?
Hmm.
Like Netanyahu firing Rodan Bar, the head of Shin Bet.
That was a huge move.
For our listeners who might not know, Shin Bet is Israel's internal security service.
Kind of like the FBI or MI5.
Right, so to fire their leader in the middle of all this,
It shows you how much pressure Netanyahu's under.
I mean, you've got to be some serious infighting going on.
Definitely.
Especially over who's to blame for that initial Hamas attack back in October.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't even a straightforward firing, was it?
No, it wasn't.
The Israeli Attorney General said Netanyahu didn't have the authority to do it.
Which just adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation.
Makes you wonder about the stability of the government.
Yeah, it's definitely a sign of internal tension.
And then you've got those massive protests happening all over Israel.
Right.
People coming out in support of Ronan Bar and against Netanyahu.
It's not something you see every day in Israel.
What's your take on that?
Well, it suggests that there's a lot of public anger and maybe even distrust towards the current leadership.
So even with all this going on, the situation in Gaza is still absolutely dire.
Yeah, it's a humanitarian catastrophe.
I mean, we talked about those overnight airstrikes that reportedly killed at least 85 people.
And most of them were women and children.
That's heartbreaking.
It raises really serious questions about the tactics being used.
And whether they're actually targeting militants like they claim.
Exactly.
And then you hear stories like the one from Beit Lahia, where 19 bodies were pulled from the rubble.
Yeah.
The head of emergency services there said it was a bloody night.
It's just unimaginable, the suffering people are going through.
And then there's the story of the Abu Dhaka family near Khan Yunis.
I heard about that.
16 people killed, including a father and 7 children.
It's just devastating.
The only survivor was a month-old baby.
That's so hard to hear.
It just brings home the human cost of this conflict in a way that nothing else can.
It's a stark reminder that behind the numbers, there are real people whose lives are being shattered.
And it's hard to square those stories with Israel's claims that they're only targeting militants.
Right. You've got the UN and human rights groups accusing them of disproportionate violence.
And specifically targeting civilians.
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect between the two narratives.
And then you've got the fact that the conflict seems to be spreading.
Yeah.
With those missiles fired from Yemen by the Houthi rebels.
Right.
Even though they were intercepted, it does suggest that other actors might get drawn in.
Absolutely.
And widen the conflict even further.
It's definitely a concern.
Meanwhile, the U.S. seems to be sticking with its strong support for Israel.
Yeah, that message from the White House about the hostages was pretty clear.
No ambiguity there.
Nope.
Which brings us to the question of the hostages and what a path to a ceasefire might look like.
Right.
Israel's demanding the release of the remaining hostages and for Hamas to basically give up control of Gaza.
And they've cut off food, fuel, and aid to try to pressure them.
So they're essentially holding the entire population hostage.
Yeah, it's a very controversial tactic.
And Hamas's position is that they'll release the hostages if Israel withdraws completely and agrees to a lasting ceasefire.
So you've got these two sides with seemingly incompatible demands.
It feels like we're stuck in this awful cycle of violence.
It's a pattern that's been repeating itself for years.
And to understand how we got here, I think it's important to look back at the beginning of this current round of conflict.
Right.
Which was that Hamas-led attack on southern Israel back on October 7th.
That was a major turning point.
It resulted in a huge loss of life in Israel, the capture of over 200 hostages.
It was a devastating event that really changed the whole dynamic.
And since then, while some hostages have been released, the death toll in Gaza has just continued to climb.
According to the Gaza Health Ministry, it's over 49,000 now.
Even if you take Israel's claim that 20,000 of those were militants, it's still an unimaginable number.
The scale of the destruction and the suffering is just immense.
And something like 90% of Gaza's population has been displaced from their homes.
Yeah, entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble.
It's really hard to comprehend the long-term impact of that.
It's going to take years, if not decades, to rebuild.
So where do we go from here?
It's hard to say.
It feels almost impossible to predict what might happen next.
Given how entrenched both sides are, it's hard to see a clear path to peace.
It's a very volatile situation.
And the stakes are incredibly high for everyone involved.
So to sum up for our listeners, what we've seen is a fragile truce collapse, almost immediately followed by a huge spike in violence. The blockade's been reimposed, there's political turmoil in Israel, and the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic.
That's about right.
And it all stems from that initial attack back in October, but it feels like we've entered a new an even more dangerous phase.
It's definitely a worrying development.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. Given how deeply entrenched these positions are, what would it really take to break this cycle of violence?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day events, but I think it's crucial to step back and think about the bigger picture.
Yeah, what are the underlying issues that need to be addressed?
Because until those are dealt with, it's hard to imagine a truly lasting peace.
I agree.
It's a challenge for all of us to think about.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure having you.
Until next time.
We'll see you then.